Удобные исторические теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы. Будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
It's 3:06 p.m. You're listening to Forgotten History. Today we are joined by economist Andrey Podoynitsyn. Hello, Andrey Vladimirovich.
Good afternoon.
Today, together with economist Andrey Podoynitsyn, we will be discussing the Mongol-Tatar yoke. Let me ask you a personal question to start. Why did you become interested in this topic?
You know, I became a supporter of the new chronology around my university years, without yet knowing the term or realizing that such a theory existed. I found the concept of nomadic invasions extremely unclear. As I pursued my economics education, I became increasingly interested in the question, what was the resource base for these invasions?
The economics of nomadic invasions?
Not just economics. Of course, economics first and foremost, but all other aspects as well. Demographic, psychological, motivational, military, logistical, everything. I was deeply intrigued by the question, how could such a world-changing phenomenon emerge out of nowhere, in a sparsely populated, cold, harsh, or conversely, extremely hot in summer and arid steppe? How could it suddenly create the greatest empire ever known on Earth in just 20 to 30 years? This question always vaguely lingered in my mind. However, the authority of official history weighed heavily, and the idea that the very concept of history might be flawed or distorted was not something that settled in my mind immediately. It took a long time to digest. It was only in the mid-1990s when I first encountered the works of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky that all these puzzle pieces began to fall into place in a harmonious and non-contradictory way. And you know, psychologically, I finally parted ways with that vague, unclear unease about the original question of, how did the phenomena of nomadic invasions arise?
What was the inconsistency in the official history that caught your attention?
Before I became familiar with the new chronology?
Yes, what troubled you initially?
Actually, we've already mentioned this, the complete lack of a resource base. First of all, the demographic one. As we know from real, reliable history, the population of such nomadic regions was typically very, very sparse. And this is understandable based on simple, material reasons. The area is extremely poor, difficult to live in, with a harsh climate. Human activity, especially in the pre-industrial era, could only occur on a very limited scale. Naturally, only small clans or families, numbering in the dozens or at most hundreds, would roam these areas. The possibility of a large population capable of fielding an army of tens of thousands, let alone hundreds of thousands, is simply non-existent. Then there's the economic, technological, and scientific base. Where is it? Where is the metallurgy? Where is the arms manufacturing? Where is military science? Where are the universities or monasteries where the future genius state builders and military leaders were trained? The Mongols, aside from being incredibly skilled warriors, were also geniuses in state building, logistics, creating systems of governance, trade, accounting, demographic records, tax collection, and economic management of these enormous conquered territories. Where did they get all this knowledge and ability? How did it happen that some Temujin, aka Genghis Khan, and a group of comrades mounted their small, short-legged horses, and in a blink of an eye by historical standards, created such a vast empire? This isn't just a myth, it's pure fantasy. It would have made more sense to claim the Mongols were Martians or, I don't know, inhabitants of Sirius.
So, let's move on to the puzzle that you have pieced together. Where did it all come together?
It all came together when I delved deeper into the question, where did the concept of the Mongol-Tatar yoke even come from? If you want to understand a phenomenon, look at how it originated. And here many answers started to fall into place on their own. Let's take the expression, Mongol-Tatar yoke, itself. When did it first appear and begin to be used in social, academic, and everyday life? Some fascinating things come to light. It turns out that the first person to use the term, Mongol-Tatar yoke, as we know it, was the German researcher Christian Kruse in 1817, meaning at the beginning of the 19th century. Before that, the term, Mongol-Tatar yoke, simply didn't exist. It only entered widespread use in the early 19th century, and in Russia, really, from the mid-19th century, when Kruse's works were translated into Russian.
I apologize, but in different sources, for example, there is data that the term yoke, not Mongol-Tatar, just yoke, appeared as early as the 15th century. At least that's what Polish sources suggest.
Jan Długosz especially stood out in this regard, as he actively promoted the term yoke. This brings us to another fascinating point. The term yoke is completely absent from Russian sources. We won't delve into when these sources became known or who wrote them and when. The plain fact is that the term yoke in Russian sources of any century is nowhere in evidence. And this is quite curious in itself. The contemporaries, the eyewitnesses of the events we're discussing, never called it a yoke. So, the term yoke is a foreign borrowing, an imported word, as you correctly pointed out, of Polish origin. It was the Poles who first used this word to describe Tatar rule in Russia. And it's clear why they used this word: to contrast themselves with the Russians. The Poles portrayed themselves as very free, while the Russians supposedly suffered under some foreign yoke for 2.5 centuries. It's a purely political concept. As we know, all history is political historiography, but in this case, it's particularly evident. In Russia, the term yoke first appeared only in the second half of the 17th century in the Kievan synopsis. Again, notice, Kievan synopsis, not a Moscow synopsis, or one from Yaroslavl or Vladimir, but from Kiev. In the second half of the 17th century, in relation to Moscow, Kiev was a province, a periphery. What is there to say, after all?
Close to Poland, so it's not at all surprising that the term yoke appeared there.
You're absolutely right. The geographical proximity and the strong, long-standing Polish influence on Ukraine and Belarus naturally play a role here. That's when the term yoke finally entered Russian usage. The synopsis itself is a fascinating work. If you look into it, you'll find that the author had a radically different view of Russia's ancient history compared to modern historians. These views were later dismissed as mythical. That's how the synopsis was selectively evaluated. But even after the synopsis, the term yoke was far from dominant in Russian historiography, and even less so in Russian self-awareness. It only became prominent after Nikolai Karamzin, and that's the 19th century. In other words, Russians themselves didn't realize until the 19th century that they had supposedly been suffering under a terrible Tatar yoke. It's almost a comical situation. 400 years pass after the yoke, and suddenly it turns out that it existed after all.
As some believe, including writers, the entire history of Russia really began after Karamzin, when he was the first to systematize and describe all the events that took place in our history.
Agree, it's strange, isn't it? If you look at it from a European perspective, for centuries, there has been this huge state with a very large population. One of the most populous, even though the population was widely dispersed across the large territory. And yet, for centuries, this state somehow magically lacked its own version of history. Moreover, to finally craft this version of history in the 18th century, foreign specialists were for some reason brought in. The well-known Baer, Schlotzer, and Muller. Lomonosov himself had a rather characteristic assessment of Bayer's work, and I'll allow myself to quote him. Lomonosov literally wrote, "It seems to me that he, that is Baer, is much like some kind of idolatrous priest who, having smoked himself with white incense and stupefied with it, and spinning around on one leg, twists his head and gives incomprehensible and completely wild answers." So, even the terminology is quite close to our own. Lomonosov basically said that Baer gives the impression of some drugged-up fabulist. The question arises, why was it necessary to invite foreigners in the first place? Moreover, these foreigners dominated Russian historical science for 100 years, up until the mid-19th century, when finally, after Lomonosov, the first Russian academic historians appeared. Why was this the case?
If we return to the yoke, what have you come up with?
Here's what we've come up with. We've established that the term yoke is of foreign origin. Let's break down the other two words in this term. Tatars and Mongols. Who are the Tatars, and who are the Mongols? I'll tell you right now, the phrase, Tatar-Mongol yoke, if we look at modern Tatars and Mongols, is an oxymoron. Because the Tatars and Mongols, in the modern understanding of these words, are two completely different groups that don't overlap and have nothing in common. Not culturally, linguistically, ethnically, mentally, or genetically. We've somehow got used to the idea that Tatars are some Asian guys, but that's nonsense. We know perfectly well that Tatars are Caucasians, part of the white race, to put it plainly. This is confirmed not only by looking at Tatars but also anthropologically and, most importantly, genetically. In the past 20 years, genetic research has confirmed this very clearly. It turns out that genetically, based on their DNA, Tatars are very close to us Russians. In fact, we and the Tatars are basically close relatives. And neither we, nor they, have any connection to the Mongoloid race. So, who were called Tatars, and when did this term first appear? Right away, we encounter something strange. When you read about the origin of the term, Tatars, today, for some reason, Chinese sources from some ancient centuries suddenly come up out of nowhere. Excuse me, but Tatars is a term from Russian chronicles, from Russian and Western sources. What do Chinese sources have to do with this? Where was China in the 13th century, and where was Europe? There are thousands of kilometers between them, and if you measure the travel time, it would take no less than a year to walk across all of Eurasia. So why would any Chinese terminology, even if it existed, become dominant in European sources? And not just dominant, but overwhelmingly so. When modern Tatar researchers discuss the origin of the word Tatars, they wisely point out that this word completely changed its meaning over the centuries. It was an ethnonym, a socio-cultural term, a religious designation, and so on. They rightly note that in the times of the Horde, this word referred to a supranational, supra-tribal military caste. In other words, the Tatars were soldiers. If you look at many foreign maps that we know of, up until the 18th century, there are plenty of these Tatarias. These different Tatarias occupy practically all of Eurasia east of the Bug River. So, looking at these maps, you could conclude that all the inhabitants of the former horde were called Tatars, just with different qualifiers. One kind of Tataria, another kind of Tataria, yet another kind.
Makes sense so far. So, where's the inconsistency?
Hold on a minute, this means that in those years, Tatars wasn't an ethnonym at all.
I wouldn't rule that out.
It was a designation for all sorts of completely different people living in a vast empire.
It's like in Herodotus, north of here are dog-headed men, and to the east, there are the Tatars.
Alright, if we sum up what we've said so far, we get that Tatars were some kind of military force in the east. That's what medieval sources meant when they spoke of Tatars. But hold on, what about the ethnic origin of these Tatars? Let's say they were a military force in the east. Okay, the new chronology claims basically the same thing, that the Tatars were simply the military caste of the then empire, the Great Mongol Empire. But where did they come from? We tend to think that the Tatars were invaders from Asia, but where does that idea come from? As it turns out, it's pure fantasy. As it turns out, over the years, the term Tatars came to refer to entirely different groups, entirely different communities. An interesting point. The self-designation of the Tatars up until the 1920s to 1930s was Muslims. Earlier, one of their self-designations was Bulgars. Today, the self-designation of the Siberian Tatars is Sibir Tatarlar, but their original name was Sabralar, meaning Siberians. There is no word, Tatars, at all. The Crimean Tatars have the same situation. Their original self-designation is Kirimlar, meaning Crimeans, as they called themselves. The word Tatars is completely absent. Therefore, the critique from modern Tatar scholars, who continuously and sometimes harshly criticize the concept of the Mongol-Tatar yoke, is entirely justified. The correlation between the medieval Tatars and today's Tatars is absolutely incorrect and does not hold up to any scrutiny. Interestingly, the situation with the term Mongols is exactly the same. The current Mongols' self-designation is Hal-Ha. Today, they are called Hal-Ha Mongols, but in reality, their self-designation is Hal-Ha. They also only recently adopted the name Mongols in the 19th century.
This gradually brings us to what you believe it actually was.
The Mongol-Tatar yoke?
Yes.
As I believe other participants of our movement have already mentioned in numerous discussions, the Mongol-Tatar yoke refers to a special period during which the Great Mogul Empire existed. Not Mongol, but Mogul. An empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and even beyond the Pacific to North America. This empire was under the rule of the so-called Mughal Khans. It so happened that the empire had two centers, Moscow and Constantinople. The yoke refers to the regime where the central power of the Mughal Khans coexisted with the self-governance of local princes. Given that at the time there were no railways, aviation, the internet, or other forms of rapid communication, a large portion of real power was naturally delegated to local governors and administrators, who were responsible for a whole range of management issues, including tax collection, conscription, maintaining law and order, ensuring the security of trade routes, and many other matters.
So, as I understand it, your theory overlaps a lot with Gumilyov's?
Well, truth be told, yes, because Gumilyov clearly stated that Mongols was a political term that originally referred only to the supporters of Genghis Khan. In other words, those who were with Genghis Khan were Mongols, meaning great. That's all there is to it. In this, we completely agree with Gumilyov. However, we slightly differ in our understanding of the chronology of events. The new chronology constructs an entirely different timeline, and therefore, places historical events differently. Gumilyov, on the other hand, did not alter the traditional chronology. He tried to build his Eurasian concept within the framework of traditional chronology, which is why he encountered numerous contradictions and inconsistencies.
There are many questions arising here, and we'll get to them later. I just want to finish this story about the yoke. So, in your opinion, it didn't exist? There was just one Mogul Empire, without an N, which existed on the territory of what is now the Russian Federation and even beyond.
Far beyond, indeed.
Which raises a number of questions. Who then fought at the Battle of Kulikovo?
A civil war.
And what about the Great Stand on the Ugra River? Who was fighting whom? So, in your opinion, were we all ethnically homogeneous at that time?
Of course not. How could we be ethnically homogeneous when traveling from one village to the next was already a historical event? And to travel to a city, well, you would prepare for that for a year or two. Naturally, any geographical separation would, in some way, separate languages, customs, to some degree rituals, culture, and so on. Just look at any mountainous areas today. You'll see that in each valley, there is a different dialect. Each valley has its own version of local history. Each valley considers itself an isolated world, where the neighboring valley may be home to close relatives, but they are already other. And as for those living on the plains, well, they are seen as completely foreign, incomprehensible people, with entirely different laws. That's how it was in the Middle Ages. Naturally, there was a great deal of geographical and linguistic diversity, but it was more of a dialectal nature. Communication was, nonetheless, carried out freely throughout the empire. I'd like to point out that in today's China, even with a unified Chinese language, there are at least 10 major dialect groups. Moreover, Southerners and Northerners don't even understand each other phonetically. Yet, this does not prevent the existence of a unified China, a unified Chinese language, the literary standard of Putonghua, and the dominant Mandarin dialect. This is all clear, but still, it should be borne in mind that in this vast country, there are incredible differences, by the way, in culture, customs, and so on. Yet there is still one China.
You started by saying that you had questions about traditional history. But I have just as many questions about your new chronology. For example, how was communication possible over such a vast territory within one empire? How could military campaigns and armies be organized across this entire vast empire in the Middle Ages? There are even more questions about logistics, organization, communication, how everything was maintained, taxes collected, and so on.
Those questions are entirely fair. It's obvious that if a conflict arose thousands of kilometers away, no one was moving armies from Constantinople or Moscow. It's clear that there were a large number of local garrisons.
Let's return to this after the news break. We are here with economist Andrey Podoynitsyn. Now, the news, and after that, we will continue. It's 3:36 p.m., and you're listening to Forgotten History. Vladimir Karpov speaking, and with us is economist Andrey Podoynitsyn, who is now presenting the concept of the yoke, or rather what existed instead of the yoke according to the new chronology. Have we covered all the main points, or are there still important aspects to emphasize?
Perhaps it's worth emphasizing that, as the current historical version took shape, the description of the yoke changed and was subjected to various discussions and debates. Specifically, what was this period, what exactly was happening during it, and so on. What is evident is the clear correlation between these descriptions and the political concepts that certain researchers adhered to. Those who were strongly inclined towards the Western European political paradigm, let's call them Westerners, tried to describe the yoke as a nightmare of oppression, suffering, and degradation. And it's clear why. They sought to highlight the alleged reasons for Russia's supposed lag behind Western Europe. Interestingly, the criteria for this alleged lag were often not specified, or if they were, they seemed to be rather stretched to fit retroactively. Russia was supposedly backward because, for example, it lacked something like cloisonné enamel in craftsmanship or some other such thing. But if we examine the realities, where does this lag or superiority really manifest itself? Primarily in the military sphere because, unfortunately, it's in this sphere that a society's talents, skills, technologies, and so forth are most concentrated. The most developed countries are usually the strongest in military terms. This is still true today, and it was certainly the case in the past. In this regard, we can hardly notice any lag in Russia. In fact, no one was ever able to dominate Russia militarily, nor even match it in direct confrontation. On the contrary, all direct military confrontations between Western forces and Russian ones ended very poorly for the Western powers.
There are plenty of other criteria: education, arts, the emergence of the first universities.
No doubt, these are perfectly valid criteria. But here's the question: how do we verify the level of education? How do we verify the timeline for the emergence of the first universities, and so on? And then, as you understand, universities aren't just some airy institutions that exist in isolation. They are reflected in real, material life. For example, from the second half of the 18th century, the English had an absolutely outstanding system of schools where craftsmen were trained. The result was evident: the Industrial Revolution. The rapid dissemination of new knowledge among craftsmen and later industrialists is a fact. Russia didn't have anything like that. As a result, by the end of the 18th century, Russia genuinely began to fall behind. In other words, Russia pretty much slept through the Industrial Revolution. And nobody disputes this. But before that time, it's hard to argue that Russia was falling behind, as there aren't clear criteria for it.
Every industrial revolution had its precursors, including technological development and everything else.
Absolutely correct, but such a technological gap is impossible to qualify. I emphasize, until the end of the 18th century, there simply wasn't one. Even in the mid-18th century, Russia produced 10 times more metal than England. This is well known to researchers, and it's clear why. Russia had vast deposits of brown iron ore, and accordingly, massive reserves of charcoal, which was the main fuel until the second half of the 18th century, when the English learned how to use coal. So, the Westerners described the yoke as a nightmare. On the other hand, the researchers we now call Eurasians didn't just dismiss the idea of any horrors from the horde, but even claimed that, in essence, the horde or the Tatars, however you name them, either had no significant influence on the Russian way of life or had a very moderate impact. Interestingly, both the Westerners and Eurasians paradoxically claimed that, in the end, the yoke and the horde contributed to the rise of a powerful Muscovite state. That's what's curious. Karamzin argued that Moscow owed its greatness to the Khans. Although, Karamzin himself was extremely negative towards the period of Mongol rule and the yoke. Many other 19th-century researchers stated that the influence of the horde was minimal. Yes, the horde collected taxes, but it was just a tithe. No matter how you look at it, this was still very moderate taxation. But the horde had no effect on Russian customs, laws, or self-governance. Remember, Russia never had a Mongol administration or garrisons. Yet, it was under the horde that the Russian Orthodox Church flourished. This is also undeniable, and it's a well-known fact in official history. Even though the Mongols supposedly burned everything they could, destroyed everything, and took people captive during their invasion, it was precisely after the Mongol invasion that the explosive construction of stone monasteries began in northeastern Russia. Where's the logic?
Fine, but there are still questions. What about folk beliefs, tales, and proverbs, for instance? There's the saying, an uninvited guest is worse than a Tatar.
What about it?
Was that introduced as well?
No. First of all, we need to ask when these proverbs, tales, and legends were recorded and codified onto a stable medium over time. That's mostly the 19th century. And when we trace back to when we first became aware of them.
But they didn't just appear from thin air?
Of course not. No one is saying they were invented or pulled out of thin air, but they were at least selected from the wide range of expressions that existed. Even if we take the well-known proverb, an uninvited guest is worse than a Tatar, and consider that the Tatars were a military elite who, among other things, enforced tax collection, the questions sort of resolve themselves. We still have a reserved attitude toward tax agents and inspectors today.
What evil did the legendary hero knights fight against?
For example, let's take the well-known Mamai, who according to the new chronology, was actually someone like the Minister of Defense under the great Khan Dmitry Donskoy, also known as Constantine the Great. In that case, the knights could have fought on either side of this civil war.
So, in your view, the Battle of Kulikovo was a civil war, and the stand on the Ugra River was also a civil war?
Let's conduct a very amusing, and I would say, entertaining historical experiment. Let's take the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1920. There, the Reds fought the Whites. Now, imagine that for some reason the continuous tradition of perceiving those events was interrupted. And we don't exactly know who the Whites and the Reds were. This could create the illusion that Europeans fought Native Americans, if we base it on skin color, for instance, whites against red-skinned people, or something similar. Notice that there were heroes on opposite sides of the barricades. Vasily Chapayev on one side, Anton Denikin on the other. From a third side, there was also the leader of the Christian insurgents, Alexander Antonov, and so on. Over time, these names became certain cultural memes. Chapayev, the hero of countless Soviet jokes and various stories. Nikolai Shores, if we talk about the Reds. Laver Kornilov, if we talk about the Whites, and so on. Now, imagine that, for some reason, the continuous tradition breaks, and the political paradigm changes. As a result, mythical heroes start to appear. An even better example is what is happening, right before our eyes today, as a fantastical Ukrainian history is being created. It would seem that the history of Ukraine and the history of Russia, at least over the past 3 centuries, is quite well known and reliable. The 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century with some caveats, and even the second half of the 17th century. There are not only a huge number of chronicles, but there is also a continuous and enormous collection of written testimonies, written sources, including documents that arise from primary human activity. Newspapers, journals, countless books. It would seem that the situation is clear. When Ukraine appeared, when Ukrainians emerged. It's clear that this is the early 20th century. There's a lot of literature, books, and dictionaries, not only Russian but also Western, where at the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainism is described as a political movement.
Next question. The appearance of names and toponyms characteristic of modern-day Ukraine in the Moscow region in central Russia, such as the village of Kievsky, which is the closest here, and so on. In official history, this is linked to the migration of people from the southwestern lands closer to Moscow during invasions. What do you think this was?
In which direction toponyms moved is always a huge question and always depends on the dominant historical concept and paradigm. Where people moved from and to.
So, in your concept, everything moved from the center toward the southwest?
Most likely. I'll try to draw a parallel, though it might not be entirely precise. In India, there are a great number of place names that directly correlate with the Russian north, with Vologda, even the Arkhangelsk region, and so on. The same question arises. How did they get there? Where did this correlation come from? Where is Vologda, and where is India? That's a distance of 10,000 kilometers, or how many? 8,000 kilometers, through various obstacles, vast mountain ranges, and so on. But fortunately, no one thought to invent that there was some kind of invasion from India. And they generally agree that the famous Aryans came from the north. However, they place this event in the times of yore, some archaic millennium BC. The situation is more complicated here because we have not only the village of Kievsky near Moscow, but we also have New Jerusalem.
As far as I remember, it's still newer than the place names associated with modern Ukraine. I suggest we move on to questions from our audience. Listener 932 asks, were the Huns nomadic peoples or not? Was there a Hun invasion, or is that also mythology?
Dear 932, I will express my personal opinion. The Hun invasion is just a paper replica of the same Mongol invasion. There were no Huns in the 5th century AD who supposedly destroyed the Roman Empire, and there couldn't have been, for the same reasons there were no fearsome Mongol Tatars, who of course never existed as an ethnic group.
So that's a myth too?
Let's say it's a replica, rewritten in different terminology, using different ethnonyms and geographical concepts of the same Mongol conquest.
Is there at least one source from the Russian Middle Ages that confirms your version? Asks listener 346.
You see, it all depends on how you read these sources. The fact is, not a single Russian source is directly present in its literal form in the traditional version of history. The same synopsis, for instance, describes a completely different ancient and classical history of Russia. Everything in any source that doesn't match the official version is declared unreliable, mythical, and carefully removed from academic circulation. There are books published during Peter the Great's time, such as those by Mavro or Bine, which describe a completely different history of the Slavs. But this has no impact. This book has been successfully removed from circulation, and almost all its claims are declared inaccurate or the author's fantasies.
Good afternoon.
Hello, Lyubov. I first learned about the new chronology from the magazine, Knowledge is Power, in 1980. Here's my question. Where exactly do the histories of new chronology and traditional history coincide? Where is the boundary?
Thank you, accepted.
Absolutely wonderful question. Here's the answer. History becomes largely reliable starting from the second half of the 17th century, and fully so by the end of the 18th century. That is, after the defeat of the so-called Moscow Tartary, a vast state that existed east of the Volga and Ural rivers. This event in traditional history is described as Pugachev's Peasant Rebellion.
So, Pugachev marks the end?
Yes, Pugachev is the conclusion of the old horde's defeat, a cleansing of history according to the new paradigm.
All right. I was also thinking of asking about the tale of the destruction of Ryazan by Batu, but I assume that falls under the mythology related to the Civil War, if I understand you correctly.
Most likely, yes.
Literary sources, retellings of folk epics, but you've already explained that. Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, could you tell me? I didn't catch the beginning of the broadcast. This is about Fomenko and Nosovsky's new chronology, right?
Yes.
I've read a lot of their works and completely agree with them. It seems inappropriate to speak about the influence of some mythical Mongols on the Slavs. After all, in Central Russia, it was the Finno-Ugric tribes who lived there, and the Slavs came from the west. So, does that mean the entire Russian ethnic group is a mix of Slavs, Finno-Ugrics, and Turks, correct?
In this case, I believe it would be very relevant to involve genetics in the discussion. These are the freshest studies from literally the last 5, 10, or 15 years. And these studies were conducted not only, and not even primarily, by Russian geneticists but by reputable international research teams. The genetic data does not confirm traditional history but instead wholly supports the new chronology. When we speak about Slavs, Finno-Ugrics, and so on, we must understand that these are linguistic categories.
I just don't understand how genetics supports the new chronology. If it was a unified state, and there wasn't any mixing, which seems odd to me. No?
Genetics supports the new chronology in very simple way. Specifically, genetics states, and geneticists write this in the clearest possible terms, that the Mongol Tatar yoke left a mark on Russian history but left no trace in the genes of Russians. In other words, the Mongoloid trace in the genes of the Russian population is no greater than that found in Western Europeans, and at times even less than in the genes of our neighbors, who belong to the white race.
How does this confirm the new chronology?
It indicates that there were never any Asian invasions of Russia.
But just as easily, one could claim that there never was a unified state at all.
Why would that be? We don't deny the anthropological and racial differences that exist, have existed, and will always exist among people. What we are saying is that, for example, if 47% of the upper Indian castes carry the R1A1 gene, which is a specific marker of the Russian population, this points to the Aryan invasions. On the other hand, there are no reverse traces of this.
Hello.
Hello, my name is Alexander, from Domodedovo. Here's my question. As we know from the official version of history, in 1700, the calendar from the birth of Christ was introduced in Russia. I'd like to know what was used before that, and what was the previous point of reference.
Thank you, noted.
Yes, this is well known that in 1700, the point of reference from the birth of Christ was introduced. Before that, the calendar was based on the creation of the world. This point of reference from the creation was derived from church calculations and traditions. This is a well-known fact. Since we're talking about 1700, I'd like to ask, until when do you think Russia paid tribute?
According to official sources?
Yes, according to history.
It's considered that the yoke ended in 1480, although tribute continued to be paid to the Crimean Tatars for some time.
Exactly, and not just for a short time, but approximately until 1700. Moreover, it wasn't only Russia that paid tribute, but as it turns out, Poland did too. Peter the Great abolished this tribute. These are the realities that specialists are well aware of, and can be read in any official historical literature, but they are absent from the popular consciousness. Popular belief is that after the stand on the Ugra River in 1480, the yoke ended and the tribute stopped. Nothing of the sort. The reality was quite different.
The reality is that to avoid raids, some money was paid to keep them from attacking. It was cheaper than fighting.
Well, then why didn't they pay off the Caucasians? They fought them for half of the 19th century.
The scale was different.
Oh, what are you talking about? The Tatar raids, the Crimean raids were also quite localized, though the Tatars did penetrate quite deeply. They were a military caste, something like the Cossacks. You could say these were Turkic Cossack raids. But still, it's a very interesting point, because the tribute was actually paid through the Crimean Khanate to Turkey. That's the intriguing part. The Crimean Khanate itself wasn't a great military threat. And when Peter attempted to campaign in Crimea, who did he encounter? Naturally, the Turkish forces.
Then came the era of the Russo-Turkish Wars, which lasted for quite a long time, and all of it ended with Crimea.
Turkey was the strongest military power until it was crushed by Russia at the end of the 18th century. That's a fact.
And here your history somewhat overlaps with the official one? Turkey, Turkic-speaking peoples, vassal dependence, and so on.
In fact, up until Peter the Great, Turkey was a very friendly state to Russia. One could even say that Russia and Turkey were bound by almost allied relations. There's remarkable evidence of this fact in the Russian state archives of ancient documents.
Economist Andrey Podoynitsyn, a supporter of the new chronology, was with us. Thank you. Andrey Vladimirovich, please come again.